Today, friends, we have the great privilege of speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi.
Shalom to you.
Great. Rabbi, I remember around 14 years ago when I was living in Israel, I would hear your name come up all the time, specifically during Pesach, regarding Kitniyot. People would tell the non-Kitniyot eaters that the head of Machon Shilo ruled that Ashkenazim could eat Kitniyot on Pesach. And that, of course, always stirred up a lot of controversy. But that's actually the first time I heard your name. And I actually thought that we were neighbors, just because I was living in Kohav Shachar at the time, and as you know, that to the west of Kohav Shachar, there's a yeshuv called Shilo. So I thought erroneously that Machon Shilo was an institution, a Machon in Shilo. But later I found out that it was in Yerushalayim. Rabbi, how and why did you begin Machon Shilo, and why did you specifically choose that name?
Well, Chazal, our sages, mention that one of the names or appellations of the Mashiach, of the Messiah, is Shilo, the Pasuk. There is a Pasuk which states, Ad ki avor Shilo, which is understood to be a reference to the Mashiach.
Genesis 49, I believe, right?
Right, and it seemed to me that this was an appropriate name in order to at least hint at the general outlook and aim and purpose of what we do. In other words, our position is that Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, have returned and continue to return to Eretz Yisrael in ever-increasing numbers. And this requires, and in fact obligates us, to recalibrate our overall philosophic understanding of, and also our halachic practice of Torah Judaism. We're not referring here to anything at all akin to conservative or reform Judaism, chas v'shalom. That's nothing to do with our agenda at all. What we're talking about is entirely authentic and traditional halachic positions and understandings based on ancient sources from the Tanakh all the way through the Torah She'Ba'al Peh, the Mishnah, and the Talmud, etc., all the way through the Rishonim up to the present time. The aim is to, as I said, to recalibrate and to define and delineate a proper form of Torah Judaism for the Jewish people from this time henceforth, leading to a period which we are all commanded to strive for and to bring about, and that is Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah. And it is not the case, as some people might believe, that the Mashiach is something that happens overnight by in a surprising and unexpected way. That's not at all how these things work. There are people who believe this to be the case, but that is a misunderstanding and a misconception of what the Torah spoke of, what Chazal and Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari and many other sources speak of. What Yemot HaMashiach is all about, as Rambam writes explicitly at the end of his monumental work, Mishneh Torah, Yemot HaMashiach is all about the Jewish people returning to their land and reconstituting themselves as a Torah nation in their land, which involves establishing a form of government rooted in the concepts and precepts of the Torah. And this is all done by our agency. Of course, we require Hashem's help in all things that we do, in all our endeavors, including getting up in the morning and taking our first steps, for which we thank Hashem every morning that we're able to do so, and as well as going about our daily affairs and making a living, and etc. Whatever we do, we are aware that Hashem enables us and assists us in doing these things. But we are required to do what we must do. And to bring about that situation called Yemot HaMashiach is really nothing more or less than reconstituting the Jewish nation according to the Torah in the land of the Torah. And that requires an entire philosophical framework and a plan of action. And the aim here with regards to Kitniyot that you mentioned, the idea is first of all to disabuse people of the notion that every single halachic practice or custom that may have become entrenched can never be changed no matter what. That is not the case. There are occasionally, not very frequently true, but there are sometimes customs or even halachic positions that are incorrect and pernicious. They are harmful in different ways, and they cause hardship, etc., etc. And such things can and need to be re-examined. So in the case of Kitniyot, for example, if one examines this issue thoroughly, one discovers that there is not only no basis for it, but that the entire concept is based on misconceptions and misunderstandings, and essentially almost none of the Rishonim, the early medieval halachic authorities who discussed the matter, almost none of them took a positive view towards this practice. That's number one. Number two, there is a broader agenda and concept involved in all of this. It's not just about can a person eat a bowl of rice on Pesach, yes or no, because that's really, although that might be very pleasing to some people, they can do so, but that's not our aim. Our aim is to, as a bit well beyond that, is to begin laying the groundwork for an halachic system that will apply equally to all Jews. In other words, to begin breaking down the galut-based divisions of Ashkenazim and Sfaradim and Temanim, etc., and to begin the process of unifying the Jewish nation as they should be. And this also is part of the Torah. This is an halachic concept which appears in the Shulchan Aruch, that Jews living in a certain area should not be split up amongst themselves into groups and sects. So the present situation, for instance, here in Eretz Yisrael, but not just here, the heter for eating kitniyot, in my view, applies to all Jews everywhere, but particularly so, even more so in Eretz Yisrael, where we have in the one city or even in the one neighborhood, or sometimes even in the same block of apartments, you have one family who eats kitniyot and another family who does not. This is not, according to halakha, this is not a healthy, nor is it a correct state of affairs.
Mm-hmm. So it looks like you use Kitniyot as a catalyst to help the Jewish people see the bigger picture, no?
Correct, true, but the thing itself, in and of itself, is also entirely true, and significant in that, for example, some people, in fact, I think many people, find eating matzot for 7 days a problem, a challenge, either for reasons of health and digestion or in terms of monetary expense. And there are many foods, such as kitniyot, which are cheap and readily available, and people enjoy eating them, and there's absolutely no reason not to eat them. And there's no reason that Pesach should be a period that people do not look forward to. It's quite the opposite. It's a hug, and it's a time that people should look forward to and should enjoy themselves. So there's also the mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov and Simchat HaMoed, of enjoying those 7 days of the Chag HaMasot. We know today, for example, that there are many people who are not allowed, or certainly it's not recommended for them to eat gluten, shall we say, or wheat products, etc., etc. This is much more common nowadays than it used to be, but it's a very real issue, and people need something else to eat apart from potatoes and more potatoes and more potatoes, and that's also an entirely legitimate halachic consideration. But yes, there is a much bigger picture, and as you say, this is one way of leading people to see that we need to reconsider many issues in order to recreate the kind of Torah Judaism that the Jewish people requires.
I also see that you're a proponent in reminding people that they could eat soft matzot, and also reminding them of the traditional practice of baking your own matzot. That's
Right,
that's
correct.
pretty unique. That's pretty unique. So,
Keep in mind, it
mhm.
might be unique today, or not common, but keep in mind that this was something that centuries ago all Jews did on a regular daily basis. They baked, first of all, they used to bake bread at home on a daily basis, more or less. And masot were no different from bread. They're just a different kind of bread. And people baked their own masot at home, as the Mishnah describes, for example. The Talmud describes people baking masot in their own homes. And the people at that time were no more knowledgeable or clever or intelligent than we are today. What they could do and did do then, we can and should do today as well. And therefore, if a person is willing to learn how to bake masot, which is not at all complicated, then it's a wonderful thing to do. I think it's also a very educational and enjoyable and fun thing to do with the children at home. Erev Pesach and even during Pesach, it's a wonderful thing. Soft masot are an entirely different experience for those who've tried them.
Rabbi, I believe that those who support your channel do so because they view it as the only medium out there fighting against the collapse of the halachic process. In other words, yeshivot not equipping their bachrim on how to distinguish between agadah and halacha, takanot from man-made minhagim, the notion of authentic smicha, and specifically not relaying or explaining the ikr, the root of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the Beit Din Hagadol. Not to mention throwing out concepts like suffix derabanan lehakel, because nowadays everything's lechumra. And this is honestly why I think your viewership is increasing. And I think what they really want to know, your audience, is when and how did you wake up from the intellectual slumber most rabbis are in today? In other words, many people view Machon Shilo and a very small handful of other websites out there as the only viable alternative to what is taught as Judaism today.
Yes, I understand your question. It's an interesting question. It depends how much time you have. But I'll try and tell the story relatively briefly. When I started studying in Yeshivat HaKotel many years ago, about 41 plus years ago, here in Israel, I remember the very first day, our Ram, our teacher, said to us, the person who taught us Gemara, he said, when you study Gemara, you have to be an apikoros, which means you have to be an apostate, an unbeliever, which is a very strange thing to say. And then he went on to explain. He says, if Abaye, one of the Chachamim in the Talmud, says something, you have to understand why he said it. And if you don't understand why he said it, don't pretend that you understood it. Ask questions. Because you can't really continue unless you've understood what he said and why he said it. And that's, I believe he was entirely correct, and that's a very important thing to say and to state. And this is, to a large extent, the spirit in which Talmud is learned in yeshivot, at least in the initial years of a person's study in yeshivot. In other words, everything is open for discussion. Questions can be asked, and you can look into different opinions and explanations and approaches, etc., etc. However, all this comes to an end if this yeshiva bocha, who happens to be, shall we say, talented and smart and drawn to further Torah study, he often finds himself in what's called a kollel. And in a kollel, usually, the program of study is changed. Instead of studying Gemara be'iyun, studying Talmud in depth, with an open mind, now they're being taught what's called halacha. And here, the express purpose is not to ask questions, and not to understand, and not to have your own ideas, not to form your own opinion. Here the aim is simply to swallow whatever it is that's being given over to you, understand that this is the halachic position that we accept, without necessarily knowing why it's the position that we accept, and what the other positions are, and why this position is superior to the other positions. And basically, you're taught to be a parrot. And this, I went through this process myself, and I saw that this, and I felt it was 100% clear and striking to me that this cannot be the way that Talmidei Chachamim are supposed to study Torah. You can't tell a person for a number of years you have to be open-minded, intellectually inquisitive and curious, and ask all the questions that you wish to ask, and delve into things in depth. Then all of a sudden switch that machine off and switch on another machine, which is now we don't want you to ask questions, and we don't want you to think for yourself. Now you just have to accept what we're giving over. And that certainly is not a system that can breed true Torah scholars. That breeds a generation, or I would say by now a number of generations of more or less programmed halachic robots, so to speak, that are aware of essentially only one position, and they're certainly aware that even if there are other positions, there's only one position that's legitimate, and they are required to express only that position, and they're not supposed to think and delve into things for themselves. They're supposed to rely on the opinions of others, no matter what. And this, to my mind, was unacceptable and intellectually dishonest and something I could not possibly go along with. So at that point, I was well, actually, it was even before I got married. This understanding became apparent to me. I was about 19 or 20 years old, and I basically studying by myself. And then I found another person in the yeshiva where I was studying. At that time was Merkaz Arav, and we studied together for many years. And that's basically how it came about. I essentially decided that I will not go along with what is expected necessarily, but I will look into things with an open mind and follow what appears to be correct and truthful.
Mm-hmm. I also spent a few years in the Old City, and I remember there's a movement growing in Israel. It's not new, but there's a yeshiva system called Zilberman. How do you feel about their manner of teaching versus what's taught in Yeshivat HaKotel and other yeshivot?
To the extent, I am of course familiar with that yeshiva, and I actually met Rav Zilberman at least on one occasion, and I have known over the years of some people who studied in that yeshiva, and I know there's an entire community of people now in the Iratika, in the Old City, who are connected to that yeshiva. I would say overall that in terms of halachic study, I think they are doing a good job. I think they are successfully training, or at least this was the case in the past. They were successful in training students to be more open-minded and to study seriously and in a forthright, intellectually honest manner, to study the sources and not be afraid of reaching certain conclusions. What I have heard from certain quarters over the last few years is that some of the sons of Rav Zilberman who run the yeshiva today are concerned and anxious to be accepted by the wider Haredi community. So I think I've heard that they play some of these things down. In other words, they try and be less different, so to speak. But I myself have not been there many years. I do not know. I cannot express with certainty, in any definite way, what exactly goes on there today. There are other yeshivot. There are not many, but there is another yeshiva which encourages I think a generally correct halachic methodology, and that is yeshiva called in the yeshuv in the town called Yad Binyamin. The name of the yeshiva is Torah HaHaim. The Rosh Yeshiva there is Rav Shmuel Tal, and there they teach also in a much more open and intellectually satisfying and authentic approach. Authentic, by authentic I mean that it is much more in line with the way the Rishonim studied Torah. The Rishonim none of the Rishonim felt that they had to agree with a previous opinion. If they thought they could not do so, they said so. And the idea that Talmidei Chachamim should study and understand certain things and reach certain conclusions, but somehow be kovesh et nevuato, which means to not express that which you believe to be true, and to, as it were, suppress the truth. That is a very much more recent concept, and it's a very unfortunate concept.
Hmm. If I heard elsewhere correctly, the Rav is a student of the late great Rav Kapach. You didn't feel that learning in Merkaz Rav Kook, was in some way a conflict of interest, being that it was Rav Kook that put the Dordaim in Nidui or Harem.
Well, first of all, uh, I'm familiar with the historical facts to which you allude. Uh, I would say, in general terms, that my personal position on such matters to do with Kabbalah, etc., are not exactly the views of Rav Kook, and also not exactly the views of the Dardaim. It's more complex and more nuanced, in my view. Although I will state, for the record, that I do not believe that the Zohar or any of the Zoharic literature was authored by Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai or his students. It was written much later, and this is something that Rav Kook himself also knew, and I have spoken about that. There is a video that we recorded on that subject, which one can find on our channel on YouTube. I have a document written by his student, the Nazir, Rabbi David Cohen, Nazir, a student of Rav Kook, and he quotes Rav Kook to that effect, that these writings were written in the Middle Ages in Spain. That's a very long and broad-ranging discussion, but in general I would say as follows. If a certain Chacham established a certain yeshiva, founded a yeshiva, and I happened to study in that yeshiva 2 generations later, and then I happen to be zoche to make a connection with Gaon Rav Yosef Gafe or Kappa. At that time also, I did not feel that there was any contradiction in what I was doing. Keep in mind that Rav Yosef Gafe himself studied in Merkaz Arav under Rav Kook. I don't know if you're aware of that fact, but he did. When he first came to Eretz Yisrael, when he first came to Eretz Yisrael, he was in the yeshiva in Merkaz Arav in downtown Yerushalayim, where the old building of the yeshiva stands to this day, and he studied there during Rav Kook's time. So obviously these things do not have to be seen as mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm. Now, that topic of the Zohar is a very interesting topic that I've spoken about in many videos. And I know there aren't too many rabbis willing to put themselves out there, especially like if they live in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, you could get your house burned down, speaking out against the Zohar. But how would you classify Agadot that carry a similar theological or mystical spin as statements found in books like the Zohar? Would you say that this is one of the main driving forces behind the creation of Mishneh Torah, almost like an attempt to muzzle Chazal, to separate the fluff from what's binding?
Can you give me an example of to what you refer?
Well, the understanding brought down by many, like for example the son of the Rambam, is that anything within rabbinic literature that's not of a halachic nature is considered agadah. So we have concepts like ruach ra, things having to do with shadim, with evil spirits and demons, that if taken literally could not just harm or hinder the individual, but the Jewish people as a whole. When fighting against the mystical, or what's considered pseudepigrapha, books like the Zohar, Sefer Bahir, how would you classify statements like these?
Well, it is true that many would say that if something appears in the Talmud, and by this they almost always mean the Talmud Bavli, and as you probably know, I advocate studying both Talmudim in tandem, together, and in a comparative way, which is also something that the Rishonim did. Many would tell you that if something is to be found in the Talmud Bavli, a certain concept or notion that has any kind of practical ramification, then yes, we must take this at face value and act accordingly. One example you mentioned is ruah ra'a. A person, let's say, when they wake up from their sleep, there's ruah ra'a on their hands, for example. This is a concept which is mentioned in the Talmud Bavli in Masechet Shabbat. It's mentioned, it's spoken of a great deal in the Zohar. On the other hand, if one looks in the Rambam, one will find that he does not mention any such idea. And the same is true of other concepts. For instance, in the Talmud Bavli, well over 60 times there are references to shedim, demons, etc. Now, I cannot prove to you that demons do not exist, just as I cannot prove to you that they do exist. But if you ask me, there are no demons. I do not believe in demons. I don't think that many people today really believe in demons. Well, and I'm willing to qualify that statement. There are people who do, I know. But there are also many, many people, particularly of a more highly educated background, perhaps a more Western background, do not believe in such things. The Rambam was way, way ahead of his time, 850 years ago, when he rejected such ideas. Also, similarly, when he rejected astrology. The Talmud Bavli has many, many references to astrology, and the clear implication is that there is truth in astrology. There is something serious there to take note of. Rambam rejected this explicitly in some letters that he wrote. He rejects this out of hand, and he makes no reference to it, of course, in his major works. He was way ahead of his time for thinking this at that time, because at that time many of the greatest Chachamim, like the Ramban, like Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, etc., very much believed in astrology, as did the vast majority of wise men in those days, in those periods of time. Today, I think it's much less controversial claim to make that astrology is not based on anything real. So it doesn't surprise me that the Rambam does not refer to this, and in a very interesting, almost mysterious way, I would say. It's very curious that a book that the Rambam wrote 850 years ago, the Mishneh Torah, and his entire approach, not just there in Moreh Nevuchim, and the various letters that he wrote, famous letters like Gereth Teman, etc. It's very curious and very interesting and very instructive to note that what he wrote then was his positions on such things like astrology were entirely radical and not widely accepted. And today, the opposite is true. It's almost as if he was writing for today and not for then. And in that sense, Rambam, I'm not saying one has to accept everything the Rambam says blindly. I don't believe that. I myself do not act in such a way or think in such a manner. And in terms of Rambam's philosophical approaches to certain issues and ideas, I do not agree with Rambam on everything. But his general approach that one can and must distinguish between the essential fundamentals and essence of the Torah and other foreign accretions to the Torah that were simply accepted by Jews in different societies in different periods of time because everyone thought these things were true. Jews and non-Jews, wise men and less wise people. Such accretions are not necessarily to be accepted, and one can reject them, and they do not form part of the core of the Torah. That was the Rambam's position, and that is also on that kind of issue. That is also my position. And there were other Rishonim who adopted a similar approach to the Rambam, like the Meiri, like Rabbi Yehuda Levi, etc.
Being that Machon Shilo is built on the notion of Yemot HaMashiach, really on a side note, what's the rabbi's personal stance on Kol HaTorah?
Kol HaTorah, first of all, are you convinced that our listeners are familiar with this work? That perhaps you should explain.
I think many who consider themselves Dati Lumi, i.e. religious Zionists or Kabbalistically inclined religious Zionists, rely on this book a lot, mainly because of the eschatological data it claims to contain. And I think people give it more weight than it really deserves because it claims to be written by the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, or his students?
Let's just state the facts first of all. There is a small book, a very short book, called Kol HaTor, which, if I'm not mistaken, was printed for the first time in Tafshin Kaf Het, 1968. It existed in manuscript form some generations, going back 100 or more years before that time. And it was known in certain circles, particularly in Yerushalayim. There were handwritten copies that were circulated. And so it's mentioned here and there, but not very much, by very few people. And the claim is that it represents teachings of the Gra, of the Gaon of Vilna, regarding the process of the Geula. First of all, I think it's clear that the Gra himself did not write it. There might be a few ideas of the Gra that can be correctly attributed to the Gra, but I also think that there are many additional ideas and claims and notions that appear there that are the product of the minds of people well after the Gra, people who perhaps saw themselves as following his footsteps, but you cannot claim they come from the Gra. The entire basis of the book is also heavily based on Kabbalistic concepts, and we mentioned Kabbalah briefly before. My overall approach is, I agree with you. I do not consider the book Kol HaTor to be of any great significance. I've never taken it terribly seriously. By the way, it's not as if religious Zionism, so-called, or Rav Kook, who was not a religious Zionist, because he never was part of the Mizrahi movement. In fact, he criticized the Mizrahi movement on a number of occasions, as appears in his letters and his writings to Rav Meir Bar-Ilan, who was the head of Mizrahi at that time. You will not find Rav Kook basing himself on Kol HaTor. In my time in Mekaz Harav, the first 4 years I was there, I knew Rav Tzvida Kook, the son of Rav Kook. I went to his shiurim. He hardly mentioned Kol HaTor, maybe once in passing, but not more than that. It wasn't something that many people paid a lot of attention to. In more recent years, some people have focused on it more, but I think this is a mistake. And I think in general that our understanding of the Torah is firmly rooted, should be firmly rooted, and can be completely based on absolutely solid, unimpeachable sources, starting from the Tanakh and the Nevi'im, working through the authentic statements of Chazal in all the different formats that we have them, the Talmudim and Midrashei Halacha and Agadah. But there also, for example, when it comes to Midrashei Haggadah, not all Midrashei Haggadah are cut from the same cloth. Some go back to the 3rd or 4th centuries according to the Christian calendar, and others were written after Rashi. One has to be aware of these facts. Most people are not, but they should be. In other words, there are things that were written down in a midrashic style by different individuals in the 10th, 11th, and even 12th centuries, in which they express their own ideas or their hopes and their aspirations, but these are not authentic Torah ideas that a person is duty-bound to accept. So one has to know how to distinguish between the different texts, and this, of course, requires knowledge and experience and understanding, which is not something that everybody has. And when it comes to even yeshiva students, this is not something they're taught. It is not as if yeshivot teach and train their students to be able to discern a later text from an earlier text, an authentic Chazalic source from a not so authentic source. So this all requires a lot of study and experience and learning, which is unfortunately not something that most yeshiva students are even aware of. I think in general I have a lot to say about the entire so-called religious Zionist or Dati Leumi world. I have much criticism of what goes on in that sector of Israeli and Jewish society. Right now, I'll limit myself to one particular thing. The very concept of Tzionut Datit means simply that you you subscribe to an ideology called Zionism, but you do so whilst wearing a kippah on your head and keeping Shabbat. That's essentially what Tzionut Datit means, both logically and also historically. That's what it was. And the problem with that is simply that Zionism was always, from its inception, a very poor and muddled concoction of ideas put together, for the most part, by Jews who were already heavily assimilated. In fact, for some of them, Zionism was a solution to their problem. Their problem was that they were trying to assimilate or not be very Jewish, but the non-Jews were not allowing them really to assimilate into non-Jewish society. Or they didn't feel quite right about declaring themselves, Russian Goyim or something like that. So they opted for the Zionist, secular Zionist option, and they were willing to come to Eretz Yisrael, and they were willing to do actually many, sometimes very heroic things. And they succeeded in many things that they did. But it was all based on a very, very confused, problematic, and contradiction-ridden ideology. That's what Zionism is. And unless one understands this, then really one cannot proceed. If one understands this fact, and then one tries to combine such a confused and problematic ideology with Torah-based thinking, then by needs and without any, one will end up with a very, very confused and problematic ideology called religious Zionism, something which cannot be the proper vehicle and ideology for the Jewish people require. It simply cannot be so. This is even more the case today, because Zionism as a concept, as a philosophy, as a political entity or movement, essentially ceased to exist the day that the State of Israel was established. And from that time to this, now over 70 years, the situation has only got worse. In other words, there is no longer any real Zionist idealism. Whatever was positive about Zionism, there were certain aspects of it which were positive, even though they were never fully internalized and conceived of correctly by even those who spoke these ideas and acted on them. But there were certain positive aspects to Zionism, but they have all dissipated and disappeared essentially. For religious Jews who want to live in Eretz Yisrael or support Jews living in Eretz Yisrael and support the national endeavor of the Jewish nation to reconstitute itself as a Torah nation in Eretz Yisrael, for such Jews to call themselves religious Zionists is essentially like a person who wishes to run a 100-meter sprint, tying a lead ball and chain to his foot. He's not allowing himself he's not giving himself a chance to succeed. What we need to do is rid ourselves of that ideology and ask the question, so what is our ideology on? What is it based? And to that I have an answer, certainly. It depends how much time you have.
So what's your opinion on Mafdal then?
Well, first of all, you use the term Mafdal, which technically no longer exists. It's called Beit Yehudi today. You're referring to a political party in Israel, which decades ago was called the Mizrahi, and then it became known as the Mafdal, and today it's called the Beit Yehudi. And that's a different question. If you're asking me from an ideological position, well, I just expressed my ideological position, more or less, or at least I began to hint at what it might be. If you're asking me what should a person do if the elections are called tomorrow and he can vote, that's a very different question, because politics and the electoral system and politics as it exists today in Israel, which of course is not how it should be. The way that the political system today works in Israel is of course not based on authentic Jewish Torah concepts. at all. And even in terms of Western-style democratic democracy, Israel is very lacking. The electoral system here is a disaster. There are over 70 democratic countries in the world today, and there's only one other country, namely Holland, that has a system which is similar to the system that exists here, and it's a disaster there as well. But here it's even worse. So even if you're thinking in terms of a Western-style democratic democracy, Israel would have to make major reforms to the way things are done. But when one has to choose whether to take part in the election, whether to participate, whether to vote, and for whom to vote, one has to take into account all kinds of questions. Namely, are you going to vote for a party that is definitely going to get in, going to cross the minimal threshold in terms of number of votes required to enter the Knesset, and therefore be a possible coalition partner? Or are you going to vote perhaps for something that your heart believes in much more, but reason dictates will have no chance of crossing that threshold, and therefore you're wasting your vote? And every Jew who wastes his vote is essentially giving two votes into the hands of our enemies, the Arabs, who also get to vote, unfortunately. So therefore, there are many considerations. It's not a question of whose views I approve the most. That's not how politics works, at least not today. It's not a question of ideology. It's a question of pragmatism and going with the least of all evils.
When you were younger, Rabbi, in Israel, did you play any part in Rav Meir Kahane Zatzal's Kach movement?
I was never a member of the Kach movement. On the other hand, I did have some connection to Rav Kahane because when I was studying, in my last few years of studying in Merkaz Harav, where I studied for over 10 years, he had two sons who studied in the yeshiva as well. And his youngest son, Binyamin Ze'ev Kahane, Hashem Yikom Damo, he and his Chavruta, his Chavruta was someone who some of you may have heard of, called Dr. Michael Ben Ari. They used to study together. They were Chavruta, and they studied in the same part of the Beit Midrash that I did, and they knew me. They saw me regularly. And at some point, the idea had been raised by some of Rav Kahane's supporters, and in discussion with Rav Kahane, to establish a yeshiva, to found a yeshiva. And when this idea began to take on some practical form, they approached me and asked if I would be willing to teach in that yeshiva. And I did, for a period of 3 years. Just over 3 years. No, this is in Yerushalayim. The yeshiva began operating in Elul Tafshin Mem Het in Tafshin Mem Zayin, I think. 1988, I think we began. And so the yeshiva was originally set up in Yerushalayim, in Shchunat Mukor Baruch. At a later time, a building was purchased in the Shmuel HaNavi neighborhood. And I taught in that yeshiva for 3 years. I taught Gemara and Halacha until Rav Kahane was assassinated, unfortunately. Hashem Yikom Damo. And then what happened was there were certain followers of Rav Kahane with whom I had no dealings with until that time, but it became apparent to me over the course of those 3 years that some of them did not particularly like me. And the reason they did not like me was because I was not a fanatical yes man who parroted everything that Rav Kahane said. In fact, on 1 or 2 occasions, I recall stating in a shiur in front of students that on this particular point I do not agree with Rav Kahane. And some of these the supporters and I would say Hasidim of Rav Kahane could not stomach this fact, and they did not like the fact that I was expressing a different position on certain points. And I even know, I became aware of this later, that some of them even approached Rav Kahane about this and tried to stir up some trouble and even perhaps get me removed from the yeshiva during Rav Kahane's lifetime. And I know that the result was that he brushed their comments and their complaints aside, and nothing of the sort happened. But when Rav Kahane was assassinated, in short order, they basically brought about a situation where I was fired, essentially, for no particular reason except that they didn't like the fact that I was not a blind parrot that repeated everything that Rav Kahane said without any qualification or without any independent input. So that was the end of my association with that yeshiva. That goes back to 1991, if I'm not mistaken.
How did you grow up? Are you what they call an FFB or a BT?
No, I was brought up in a Orthodox home. My father, Lava Shalom, was an Orthodox rabbi, always was, from my earliest memories of him. I was born in Australia, in Sydney, and I lived there till I was 10, almost 11. At that time, we moved here to Israel. We lived in Yerushalayim for 8 months when I was 11 years old. At that time, my father was completing his smicha studies, and he received a smicha from then Rav Rashi of Israel, Rav Yehuda Unterman, and then for the following 5.5 years, from August 1971 till January 1977. We lived in New Zealand, in Auckland, New Zealand. My father was the rabbi in Auckland. That's where I spent my high school years. I finished high school somewhat early. I was still 16 years old. And immediately on the 25th of January 1977, I got on a plane from Auckland and I made my way here and began studying yeshiva in earnest. And I landed here on the 26th of January, I recall. 1977, and essentially I've lived here ever since.
On a side note, I want to tell the audience about the Rav's Sidurim and Machzorim, his books on the prayer liturgy, known as Nusach Eretz Yisrael. And I remember that the Bet Knesset in my yeshuv actually had a copy, and I was going through it, and I remember noticing that you excluded anything that had to do with prostrating during Tachanun or during Nefilat HaPayim. Why is that?
I did not include such a thing for a number of reasons, although I'm not saying that I'm entirely opposed to such a practice, but I do not think, on the other hand, that it's chovah, it's not required. But if a person wishes to do so, I think it's perfectly legitimate to do so. In general, Nefilat HaPayim, Tahanun, is not an absolute chovah. Chazal did not discuss it as such. There's a famous Teshuvah of the Rivash where he mentions and explains that Tahanun, Nefilat HaPayim, is actually a minhag, which there are hints of this minhag already in Chazalic times, but it was never formulated as and described as a chovah. And Mimela, it follows that the different practices associated with Tahanun, with Nefilat HaPayim, such as some people prostrating themselves on the floor when saying those pesukim, etc. That's also part of the minhag. It's part of a custom which became very well entrenched, but it's not something which is absolutely a chovah. And so I think a person is able, and it's legitimate for a person to choose how they want to go about this practice. I know some people who, in their own home, perhaps they would do hishtahawaya and prostrate themselves on the floor, but in a Beit Knesset where no one is doing so, they won't do so, in order not to cause dissension and mahloket.
And finally, Rabbi, I'd really like to touch on a topic that I think is the only area we really disagree on. I have an organization called Torah, Judaism International, which actively proselytizes. It encourages Gentiles to consider becoming Jewish. This began when I was living in Israel. I was a Makarov. I was an outreach worker in Hebrew U. I used to work for Rabbi Jeff Seidel in Jerusalem. And like many who work in that field know, especially in the universities, that whenever you have an event to try to draw unaffiliated Jews back to Torah, you typically end up getting more Gentiles than born Jews. So I asked the question. Not that I needed to ask the question, really, but nowadays, if you don't have a haskama, your opinion really doesn't mean anything. So I approached the Rosh Hashiva of the Derech program in Or Sameach, and I asked, "What's the issue? Is it okay for a Jew to encourage a Gentile to want to become Jewish?" And he wrote me a nice letter. I consider it some sort of chetzer that says there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. That by definition, a goy is already a ben or a bat noach, so becoming a noide is nothing really to embrace, and that by becoming Jewish, they'd have a bigger chalik in Olam Haba as well as here in Olam Hazeh. So since then, my organization actively encourages Gentiles to become Jewish, and I saw you make a video that in some way discouraged that or offered noideism first as an option to Gentiles interested in converting. Can you elaborate on that?
I have absolutely nothing at all against a non-Jew wishing to convert to Judaism, if that's what the person truly wishes to do, and if, as long as the person in question understands what that entails. Not all non-Jews who consider this option are truly fully aware of what it entails. And my experience, and the experience of many others over the years, has been that not a few of those Gentiles who convert later regret it for various reasons. Some of them are very unfortunate reasons. Sometimes it has a lot to do with the fact that they feel that they are not accepted by the Jewish community in the place where they live, and that's a very serious problem. But it's also a fact. It shouldn't be that way, but it's a fact, and I know it to be so. And it's not something that we can sweep under the rug. If more than once I've heard from converts that they find that they're not really accepted by born Jews, by regular Jews, even though they've been members of that community for years, and no one can doubt their religious commitment and their halachic lifestyle. Nevertheless, sometimes, very frequently, in fact, there are people who feel that they're always somehow viewed with some suspicion. That is something that non-Jews have to know. People who are considering conversion, that is something they need to know. And that was the purpose of, that was what I was trying to convey in that particular video. But if a person aware of these facts says, nevertheless, I know what's involved, and I know it may not be very easy, but I'm willing and ready to accept those conditions and those realities, and I wish to convert and be a fully fledged Jew, then I am the last person to try and talk such a person out of that path. I just think that they need to be aware of the various pitfalls and difficulties which they are quite likely to discover along the way. That's all. And because I've seen many cases and I've heard such comments and complaints, very often justified, from converts. So therefore, I felt it necessary and correct to inform people they don't need to convert unless they are really committed 100% to that path, to that track, and are aware of what it may entail, and that it may not be a garden of roses.
It seems to me that the problem is not with the person converting, or the burden really shouldn't be with him, but the blame is clearly on the Jew mistreating the potential convert. In other words, we're burdening the victim because of the acts of the aggressor. But if you think about it, it actually goes against the halakha. In Serbia Yudalid chapter 14, it lays down the steps one must take when confronting a potential convert. And it tells you that you must warn him, but it tells you to warn him of outside pressure, of what the Gentiles will do to you and how they'll treat you when you become Jewish. But it says nothing about inside pressure, of how Jews will mistreat you after you convert. In other words, by adding that additional information, we're almost like going against the halakha.
I would agree that the Jewish world certainly has what to consider. There is definitely room for introspection in this area, to examine whether we are, as a nation, as communities, whether we're acting correctly and properly. I believe that to be true. On the other hand, it must be stated, and we should not be naive and disingenuous about this. We know that, I believe this to be the case, that the very frequently negative attitude of Jews to converts is based also on a certain reality, a very unfortunate reality, and that is that, and this is very possibly not the case 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, but it is the case today, that certainly in recent generations, the experience shows that a very significant percentage of converts convert for the wrong reasons. They mislead those who teach them. They mislead the Batei Din that convert them as to their intentions and their motives. And again, a significant percentage of them eventually convert, but after a while they cease living according to any kind of Torah lifestyle. They do not keep mitzvot, even the most basic mitzvot, etc., etc. I've seen many such cases with my own eyes. And this is something that all people, all rabbis and Jews who have experience with the conversion scene, shall we say, nowadays, will confirm. So when you have a significant percentage of converts giving a bad name to converts in general, one can understand where this reluctance to accept converts fully and without any kind of suspicion, etc. One can understand where this is coming from. I'm not justifying it, and I know that it is very often not justified. But one has to be entirely honest about what brought this situation about. And it's a very unfortunate state of affairs, no question.
Do you share a similar approach to a Choser B'Tshuva, a Baal Tshuva who chooses to return? In other words, being that a unaffiliated Jew is not really liable for what he's doing because he doesn't know any of the commandments, by you encouraging him to return into the fold, you may also be exposing him to mistreatment. From what I've seen, Baal Tshuvas probably have a higher dropout rate than converts, just because converts give up more to join the Jewish people. So, in a similar fashion, do you think that Jews returning back into the fold should be given this disclaimer?
I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with what you're mentioning now. I'm not aware of the fact that Baalei Teshuvah experience the same kind of suspicion or reticence on the part of the Jewish community in which they find themselves to accept them. I'm not familiar with that phenomenon, not at all.
Even
And
regarding
also, I'm
Shidduchim.
also not convinced. I'm also not. Well, when it comes to Shidduchim, that's a very personal issue. Every person and every parent and every young person who wishes to get married has their own idea as to the kind of person and the kind of background that person should have the kind of person they wish to marry. And you cannot force anyone to marry someone that they're not comfortable marrying. So that is something that people have to deal with autonomously and freely as they see fit. But I have not seen or heard that Balei Teshuvah are broadly speaking discriminated against or not viewed kindly or not dealt with properly. I haven't seen that. I am aware that some people will not want their child to marry a Baal Teshuvah, or at least certain kinds of Balei Teshuvah, and I can understand where that concern comes from as well, because I can understand a parent telling me, my daughter wants to marry this young man, he's from an Orthodox home, but it's not the kind of Orthodox home that I really approve of, and I'm not convinced that this young man therefore grew up in a home that where all the various values and modalities of Jewish behavior and life were experienced by him, were endorsed by the family, and he witnessed them and saw them in practice on a daily basis. And therefore, I want something different for my daughter. I can understand a person who says that. I think any person should be able to understand that. After all, when considering whom one should marry, this is one of the, if not the most important decision that a person makes in their lifetime. And it's also a fact that usually and hopefully a person makes this choice to get married at a young age. And it's also a fact that older people tend to have more experience and know more about many things than younger people. And therefore younger people should definitely, at the very least, discuss these things very seriously with their parents and maybe their teachers, etc., not be motivated and driven by less than by the wrong kinds of considerations and certain emotions at that particular moment in time. Getting married is a very serious business, and setting up a Jewish family is a very serious business. And trying to do so correctly as one can, that is a tremendously responsible and weighty decision.
Rabbi, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to plug your website, machonshilo.org. There, people could get a copy of Nusach Eretz Israel. Are there any?
Don't forget our YouTube channel, also known as Machon Shilo or Torah Nation Machon Shilo. All our videos are recorded twice, once in English and once in Hebrew. And there are, I believe, hundreds of shirim now on the channel in English and Hebrew. And we encourage people to go and view them and hear them and hopefully find something that is helpful and useful and edifying and informative.
Thanks again for your time. Thank you.
All
Rabbi.
the best to you, and kol tov to you and the listeners. Bye-bye.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button, which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Israel, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.